My son Michael hurled his glass against the table and screamed with rage. "That's it. I'm done with this lot. Pack your bags. Nobody needs you here." Then my husband Thomas stood up slowly, gazing at Michael with eyes full of sadness. No one could have predicted what would happen next. My son threw his wineglass straight onto the floor. The crash made everyone jump except me. I had been waiting 3 years for him to lose control like this. And now, watching the red wine spread across the carpet in my dining room, I felt only cold satisfaction. "It's over. Mum, pack your bags. Nobody needs you here." His voice was so loud it actually hurt my ears. 12 people sat frozen around the table where we were celebrating our wedding anniversary. Forks were suspended halfway to mouths, staring at my son as if seeing him for the first time. In a sense, they were. I had known who he really was for 3 years. They were only finding out this evening. I kept my hands folded in my lap and looked at him without blinking. I didn't cry, I didn't argue. I simply observed him the way one observes a stranger having a tantrum in a supermarket with detached interest and a shred of pity. That seemed to enrage him even more. My husband gripped his fork so tightly I thought it would snap. Across the table, my daughter-in-law Kate stared down at her plate. Her face was burning red with shame. My sister Anne squeezed my knee twice under the table. Our signal. I nodded once, barely moving my head. Yes, tonight. We do it tonight. My son was now pacing behind his chair. His blazer was crumpled. His tie hung loose. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had been drinking since 4 p.m. and had arrived an hour late to his own parents' anniversary dinner. A distinctively expensive watch on his wrist caught the light. I knew exactly where the money for that watch had come from. He had stolen it from us. "Sit down," I said quietly. "You're making a scene." He laughed, but it sounded wrong. Too sharp, too defensive. "I'm making a scene? You, for months. You question every decision I make in the company. You show up at the office when you shouldn't be there. You ask about accounts that have nothing to do with you, acting like you know anything about running a business." I let him speak. Over these 3 years, I had learned something important. Guilty people always talk too much when they are backed into a corner. They can't help themselves. Our friend Robert shifted uneasily in his chair. His wife leaned in and whispered something urgent to him. Everyone could see that something was very wrong, but they didn't understand what yet. My son continued, his voice rising. "You spend all this money on fancy restaurants and expensive dinners while the company is struggling? Do you even think about that? Do you care?" Before we continue, if you are enjoying this story, please take a moment to like and subscribe. I share new moving stories every day, and I would love to know where you are listening from. Leave a comment below with your city or country. The company was only struggling because he was stealing from it, but I didn't say that. Not yet. Instead, I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and carefully set it down. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about the company. I was looking through the discretionary accounts last week and noticed a few interesting things. His face changed for a second, maybe half a second. Pure fear flashed across his features before he covered it with anger, but I saw it. I was watching for it. "Interesting things." He tried to brush it off with a laugh. "Mum, you wouldn't recognize an accounting irregularity if it walked up and introduced itself. These accounts are complicated. They involve consultancy fees and equipment purchases that someone who actually understands business would have to interpret." "Consultancy fees," I repeated, keeping my voice light and conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. "Yes, I saw quite a few payments like that to companies I'd never heard of before. I tried searching for them online, but I couldn't find any websites or business registrations at Companies House. Isn't that odd?" The color drained from his face. The whole room seemed to hold its breath. Then he shook it off and forced another laugh that sounded like something cracking. "This is madness. I don't have to explain basic business operations to someone who has never had a real job in her life." Then he grabbed another wine glass and threw it so hard it exploded in his hand. He didn't even notice he was bleeding, pointing a shaking, bloodied finger at me. "Pack your bags, get out. Nobody wants you here." Complete silence. Even the noises from the restaurant kitchen ceased. I watched a drop of his blood hit the white tablecloth and spread into a dark stain. My heart beat steadily. I had imagined this exact moment so many times, lying awake at night next to my sleeping husband, that I felt like I was watching it happen to someone else. My husband stood up, not quickly, not dramatically. He simply rose from his chair with that slow, deliberate movement that commands attention. He reached under the table and pulled out a thick folder of documents I hadn't noticed him bring, at least 2 inches of paper. He placed it on the table in front of our son with a dull thud that somehow seemed louder than all the shouting. "Open it," my husband said. 2 words. That was all. But his voice carried such weight that everyone at the table froze. My daughter-in-law began to weep quietly. Tears streamed down her face as she finally looked up from her plate where she had been hiding. My son's hand was still bleeding as he reached for the folder. His fingers were trembling so much he could barely grasp it. He opened it and looked at the first page. I watched his expression change. Confusion, then recognition, then something that looked like terror. He started turning the pages faster and faster. His breathing quickened. I leaned forward slightly. When I spoke, my voice was calm and clear enough for everyone to hear. 3 years. I've been documenting everything for 3 years. My son stared at the spreadsheet before him. His bleeding hand left red fingerprints on the white paper, but I was no longer in that restaurant. In my mind, I went back 3 years, standing outside his office door on a Tuesday afternoon in March, holding a container of my husband's favorite chicken soup I had made that morning. That was the day everything changed. I hadn't planned to stop by the office. My husband mentioned he was coming down with a cold, so I decided to bring him lunch as a surprise. The receptionist told me he was in a meeting, so I thought I'd leave the soup on his desk with a note. On the way to his office, I passed my son's door. It was slightly ajar, and I heard his voice. He was supposed to be in London for a client meeting. That's what he told us at Sunday dinner 2 days prior. I stopped. I shouldn't have listened, but something in his tone made me hesitate. He sounded stressed in a way I had never heard before. "You have to sort this by Friday," said another male voice over the speakerphone. "The bookies don't take excuses, and you're already 3 weeks late with the payment." My hand tightened on the soup container. Bookies. My son didn't gamble. He always said gambling was for people who didn't understand maths. "I'll sort it," my son replied, his voice almost pleading. "I just need to shift some funds from the discretionary accounts. My parents never check them properly. They're too busy pretending to understand business to actually look at the numbers." My parents. He said it with such disdain, with such absolute certainty that we were too stupid to notice anything. I stood there in the hallway, the soup going cold in my hands, and felt something shift in my chest. Not anger, yet something colder than anger. Something patient. I didn't go into his office. I didn't leave the soup for my husband. I went back to my car, drove home, and sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours staring into space. Then I opened my laptop and typed into the search bar, "How to detect embezzlement." The next 3 months became my education. I learned forensic accounting from free online courses. I watched videos on YouTube about tracing fraudulent transactions. I read articles about patterns of workplace theft and how gambling addiction fuels financial crime. Every afternoon, while my husband was at work and my son thought I was at my book club or socializing, I was learning how to catch him. It took me 6 weeks to find the first fraudulent transaction. I had to ask for access to the company accounts, which meant explaining to my husband that I wanted to understand the business better. He thought it was sweet that after all these years I was taking an interest. He gave me all the passwords without hesitation. The transaction was hidden in a quarterly report under the heading consultancy fees, £750 paid to a company called Meridian Business Solutions. I searched for this company everywhere. Company's House, Google, LinkedIn, industry databases. It didn't exist. The check had been deposited into an account that I eventually traced back to my son. I printed the record of the transaction and hid it in a folder I kept deep in my wardrobe. Then I kept looking. By the end of the first month, I found 4 more fake invoices for advisory services totaling £25,000. Each discovery was a small, grim victory. My son had underestimated me so much he hadn't even tried to cover his tracks well. He truly believed his mother was too naive to notice anything. Sunday dinners became performances. I sat across from him and complimented his new watch. I asked about his expensive holidays. I admired the bespoke suit he was wearing. He smiled and accepted my praise, never knowing that I was tracking exactly how much he had stolen to pay for every item. Once, I asked him directly about his Rolex, which cost at least £10,000, and he said he got a performance bonus. I knew for a fact no bonuses had been issued that quarter. I smiled and said how proud I was of him. 4 months after starting my investigation, my husband found me in my study at home at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday. The desk was covered in spreadsheets, bank statements, and printouts of transactions. I was so absorbed in tracking a series of fake equipment purchases that I didn't hear him come in. "What is all this?" he asked. I looked at him, and in that moment, I made a decision. I couldn't carry this alone anymore. "Close the door," I said, "and sit down." I showed him everything, every fraudulent transaction, every fake company, every forged signature I had found. I watched my husband's face go through shock, disbelief, and finally a kind of broken acceptance that squeezed my heart. This was our son, the boy he taught to ride a bike, the young man he proudly gave a position in the family business, and he was robbing us blind. "We confront him tomorrow," my husband said, his voice trembling. "We stop this immediately." "No." My voice sounded sharper than I intended. "We don't." He looked at me like I had lost my mind. Maybe I had, but I knew with absolute certainty what had to happen next. I need more evidence. I need a pattern so clear that no lawyer could explain it away as mistakes or misunderstandings. Furthermore, I need to see how far our son will go. I need to understand who he has really become before I destroy his life. It took until 3 a.m. to convince my husband to trust me, to wait, to watch, to document everything while our son continued to steal from us. My husband struggled with it every day after that, but he followed my plan. Over the next 2 years, the amounts grew. £900 here, £1,000, £400 there, one transfer for £20,000 that my son coded as urgent infrastructure repairs that never happened. Every theft was another page in the folder, another nail in the coffin I was building for him. Every stolen pound became another piece of evidence, another line in the spreadsheets I updated weekly. But 6 months ago, something happened that I hadn't planned for. Something that made me realize my son's crimes went much deeper than stealing money from his parents. My daughter-in-law, Kate, showed up at my door on a Thursday morning unannounced. I opened the door and saw her standing there with her handbag clutched tight to her chest. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Can I come in?" she asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Please, I need to talk to you." I led her to the kitchen and made tea, the same thing I did when she was dating my son and came over nervous to meet the family. Back then, she was bright and confident, a young woman with a degree in social work and plans to open her own therapy practice. Now she looked like someone who had been carrying a terrible weight for too long. "I don't know what to do anymore," she said, and then she started crying so hard she could barely breathe. I pulled a chair next to hers and put my arm around her, letting her sob into my jumper. When she finally calmed down enough to speak, the story came out in pieces. Their savings account was empty. All the credit cards were maxed out. 2 weeks ago, she discovered a second mortgage on their house, and the signature on the documents was supposed to be hers, but she had never signed anything. The handwriting looked similar enough that the bank accepted it, but she knew she had never seen those papers before. "He forged my signature," she said, staring at her hands. I confronted him about it, and he said I must have forgotten signing it. He said I'm losing my memory, that I need to see a doctor. He made me feel insane. I already knew about the second mortgage. I found it in my research 3 months prior. I also knew about the maxed-out credit cards. What I didn't know was that my son was gaslighting his wife into doubting her own sanity. "How much debt are you in?" I asked gently. She looked at me with eyes full of shame. "I think maybe over £80,000, but I'm not sure. He won't show me the full picture. He says it's his job to handle the finances, and I should focus on looking after the children." Over £80,000 that she knew of. The amount he had stolen from the company was probably far higher by now. My son was drowning in gambling debts and dragging his wife down with him. "I want to leave him," she whispered, "but I have no money, no savings. Our house is double mortgaged, and if I try to divorce him, he'll fight for custody. He already said if I ever try to leave, he'll make sure I never see them again. He said, No judge will grant custody to a woman with no income and nowhere to live. I looked at this young woman who had married my son 8 years ago, who had given me 2 beautiful grandchildren, who was slowly being isolated, controlled, and bullied into silence. And I made a decision that changed both our lives. "I need to show you something," I said. I went to the wardrobe and pulled out the folder I had kept for nearly 3 years. It was thick now, bursting at the seams with documents, printouts, and bank statements. I brought it back to the kitchen and laid it on the table between us. "What is this?" she asked. "This is evidence that your husband has been stealing from the family business for 3 years. Embezzlement, fraud, forged signatures on company documents." I opened the folder and showed her the first spreadsheet. "This is the £100,000 he has stolen from us so far. I've documented everything." Her face went completely white. She stared at the papers as if she couldn't process what she was seeing. Then she looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "You knew." Her voice was strange, flat. "You knew for 3 years that he was stealing, and you didn't stop him." "I was gathering evidence," I said calmly. "I needed enough proof that no lawyer could explain it away. I needed a pattern that would lead to real consequences." She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers touching the edge of the spreadsheet. "What kind of consequences?" "Prison," I said. "Serious charges for fraud over a certain amount carry a significant sentence, and if he forged your signature on that mortgage, that's mortgage fraud. That's another serious charge." I watched her process this information. The shock gave way to something else, something harder, something that looked almost like hope. "Can you help me?" she asked. "Can you help me get the children away from him safely?" I reached across the table and took her hand. "I already have a plan," I said, "and now you are part of it." Over the next 6 months, my daughter-in-law and I became partners in a mission neither of us had asked for. I put her in touch with Martha King, one of the best divorce solicitors in the county, and paid for the consultations with money from an account my son didn't know about. We met in coffee shops on the other side of Manchester, in places where no one from our circle would recognize us. Martha was in her 50s, sharp and effective, and she immediately understood what we were dealing with. "Financial abuse, forged documents, threats regarding custody," she said, making notes. "We can build a strong case, but timing is everything. When do you want to file?" The same day as the divorce papers, I told Martha, watching my daughter-in-law's face as she absorbed the timeline. Everything happens at once. Now, sitting at the anniversary table, watching my son turn the pages of the folder with shaking hands, I saw the moment arriving exactly as I had planned. His face had gone from pale to gray, and his bleeding hand was leaving red smears on the white pages. Every document he touched was another piece of the trap closing around him. The first page was the master spreadsheet containing every fraudulent transaction from the last 3 years. Dates, amounts, account numbers, fake company names he had invented. Meridian Business Solutions, Summit Equipment Consulting, Apex Facility Services. None of them were real. All were ways to funnel our money to his gambling debts. £7,500 here, £9,000 there, £20,000 in one desperate transfer last month, when he must have been in serious trouble with the people holding his debt. My son looked up with wild eyes. "Dad, I can explain this. There are legitimate reasons for all these things." "Keep reading," my husband said quietly. His voice was calm, but I heard the pain underneath. This was killing him in a different way than it was killing me. I had spent 3 years preparing for this moment. He had only known for 2.5, and it still felt fresh and painful to him every time we documented another theft. My son turned to the next section. Bank statements showing deposits into his personal accounts that matched perfectly with the amounts stolen from the company. Then, photographs printed in color on plain paper. Him walking into a casino in London on a Tuesday afternoon in April, when he told us he was visiting a potential client. Him at the blackjack table, a stack of chips in front of him. The timestamp on the photo showed 3 p.m. on a workday. Around the table, our guests had fallen silent. Robert put down his fork and stared at my son with growing horror. His wife had a hand over her mouth. My sister sat motionless beside me, her hand still resting on my knee under the table. She had been present at so many meetings with Martha. She had witnessed my daughter-in-law's tearful confessions. She had helped me organize documents when the evidence became overwhelming. "Where did you get these?" my son asked, his voice cracking on the last word. "Does it matter?" I asked. My voice sounded colder than I expected. "The question isn't where we got the evidence. The question is, why did you think you'd never get caught?" He looked at me as if seeing someone he didn't recognize. Good. I wanted him to see how much he had underestimated me. My husband reached across the table and flipped to a page near the back of the folder. "We filed serious criminal charges against you this morning with the Crown Prosecution Service. Embezzlement totaling over £250,000, wire fraud, mortgage fraud, for forging your wife's signature on documents we know she never signed." The restaurant seemed to tilt around us. I heard someone gasp, though I couldn't tell who. My son's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. "You forged Kate's signature?" Robert's wife asked, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Where is Kate?" my son managed to say, looking around the table as if only just realizing his wife was gone. She had been sitting next to him during the first part of dinner, quiet and tense. She had excused herself before dessert, saying she needed to check on the children with the babysitter. He had barely noticed she left. "Kate is safe," I said. "She and the children are in a place where you won't find them. Tomorrow morning you will be served with divorce papers, full custody orders, exclusive access to any remaining assets, and a restraining order keeping you away from her and the children, except for supervised visits once you get out of prison." The word prison seemed to hit him physically. He actually flinched. "Mom, please." His voice became pleading. "I can pay it all back. I can fix this. Just give me a chance to fix it." "You had 3 years of chances," I said, "every Sunday dinner when you sat across from me and lied about where you were, what you were doing, how the business was going. Every time you mocked my intelligence or dismissed my questions, every time you made your wife feel insane for noticing money was missing. Those were all chances to stop, to seek help, to be honest. You chose not to take any of them." My husband pulled another document from the back of the folder. "This is a sworn affidavit from your wife detailing the financial abuse, the threats you made regarding custody, the isolation tactics you used to control her. She has text messages, recorded phone calls, and statements from her therapist about the psychological damage you caused." "You turned my own wife against me?" my son asked, looking at me with something close to hatred. "I gave your wife the means to save herself and her children from you," I corrected. "That is not the same thing." I witnessed much of the evidence gathering. My sister spoke up for the first time. Her voice was quiet but firm. "I will testify in court if necessary, to what I saw and heard." My son looked around the table at the faces that, an hour ago, had been friendly and familiar. Now they looked at him with disgust, shock, and a sense of betrayal. He tried to stand up, pushing his chair back so hard it almost tipped over. My husband's hand rested on his shoulder, pressing him back into the chair with surprising strength. "You're not going anywhere. The police are waiting outside the restaurant. You are going exactly where you should have gone 3 years ago, to face the consequences of your choices." My husband's hand remained firmly on our son's shoulder, holding him in place, as if he might try to run. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the restaurant doors opened, and 2 police officers walked towards our table with the calm, measured steps of people who had done this many times before. My son saw them coming. His eyes widened, and I watched all the color drain from his face until he looked almost gray in the candlelight. He tried to stand again, but my husband's grip tightened. The officers reached our table and stood on either side of my son's chair. One was older, maybe in his 50s, with graying hair and tired eyes. The other was younger, a woman with her hair in a tight bun. "Are you Michael Smith?" the older officer asked. My son couldn't find his voice. He just nodded, a small, jerky movement that made him look like a child caught in the act. "Please stand up," the female officer said. Her voice was professional but not unkind. Robert half rose from his chair across the table. "Wait, what is this about? There must be some mistake." He looked at my husband with confusion and rising anxiety. "Thomas, what is happening?" My husband's voice was calm when he answered, though I could hear the exhaustion in it. "Our son has been embezzling money from the family business for over 3 years. We filed charges this morning." The words hung in the air like smoke. Robert sank back into his chair. His mouth opened and closed without sound. His wife put a hand on his shoulder, her face pale with shock. Around the table, I saw the same expression repeated on every face: disbelief. The sudden realization that the successful young businessman they knew was actually a criminal. My son slowly stood up as the officers guided him. The older officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs, and I heard someone at the table make a small sound of distress. It might have been Robert's wife. It might have been someone else. I kept my eyes on my son's face. "Michael Smith, I am arresting you on suspicion of fraud by abuse of position, theft, and fraud by false representation," the officer said, and began to read him the caution. "You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence." The words were familiar from thousands of television shows, but hearing them spoken over my own son sounded strange and surreal. The handcuffs clicked. That sound seemed louder than it should have been. Final. Irreversible. My son turned to look at me, and for the first time since this dinner began, I saw real fear in his eyes. Not anger anymore, not indignation, just pure, desperate fear. "Mum, please," he said, his voice cracking. "Please don't do this. I can pay it all back, every penny. Just give me a chance, please." I looked at my son standing in his expensive suit with his hands cuffed behind his back, and I felt nothing but a cold, distant sadness for who he could have been if he had made different choices. "You told me to pack my bags," I said, my voice flat and emotionless. "You said nobody at this table wants me. You were wrong on both counts. I'm not going anywhere, and everyone here now knows exactly who you are." The officers began to lead my son towards the restaurant exit. He turned back to look at the table, at the people who just 2 hours ago were laughing and talking with him. Now they watched as he was led away in handcuffs, and I could see on their faces that they would never look at him the same way again. His expensive suit and designer shoes looked ridiculous now, like a costume that no longer fit the person wearing it. When the restaurant doors closed behind him, the silence at our table was absolute. No one knew what to say or where to look. I picked up my water glass and took a sip. My hands were completely steady. My sister spoke first. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "What is the legal procedure?" I was grateful for the question. It gave me something concrete to focus on, instead of the strange, hollow feeling starting to creep into my chest. Now that it was over. "The bail hearing will be on Monday morning," I said. "They'll set bail, but our solicitor thinks it will be denied. The amount of stolen money is significant, and there is a flight risk given the severity of the charges. Then the case will go to trial. Everything will come out. The gambling addiction, the fake companies, every fraudulent transaction." My husband added, "We also contacted HMRC yesterday. He never reported any of the stolen money as income. That opens the door to additional charges for tax evasion." Robert leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He looked as if he had aged 10 years in the last hour. "Thomas, Elizabeth, I have to ask. If you knew about this 3 years ago, why did you wait so long? Why didn't you stop him sooner?" It was a fair question. I expected someone would ask it eventually. "Because I wanted to see how far he would go," I said, and I heard how cold my voice sounded. I wanted evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away as accounting errors or misunderstandings. I wanted a pattern so clear that no barrister could claim it was anything other than deliberate theft. I paused, looking at my folded hands. And because I wanted to understand exactly who my son had become before I destroyed the life he built on lies and stolen money. The table fell silent again. I felt people processing what I had just said, the calculated nature of it, the patience required to watch someone you love commit crimes for 3 years without stopping them. Some of them probably thought I was cruel. Maybe I was. Then I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Kate walking towards our table. My daughter-in-law, my partner in all this, had been waiting in the back of the restaurant with the children at a separate table, far enough away that they wouldn't witness their father's arrest. She walked straight to me and threw her arms around me. Her grip was tight and desperate, and I felt her whole body shaking as she whispered, "Thank you," against my shoulder. I held her carefully, aware that everyone at the table was watching us, trying to piece together what role this young woman had played in the evening's events. When Kate finally pulled away, her face was wet with tears, but there was something else in her expression now. Not just relief, something stronger. She looked like someone who had finally stopped carrying a burden that had been crushing her for years. "Where are the children?" I asked quietly. With my mum, she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She picked them up from the back table 10 minutes ago. I didn't want them to see any of this. She glanced towards the restaurant entrance where my son had been led out in handcuffs. I told them Daddy had to go to work early. They believed me. They always believed me when I made excuses for him. The bitterness in her voice squeezed my heart. How many times had this young woman covered for my son? How many lies had she told to protect him, to make the family look normal on the outside? 3 months later, I sat in the Crown Court and watched those lies come out one by one. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. I had imagined something grand and imposing like in the films, but it was just a plain room with fluorescent lights and uncomfortable wooden benches. My husband sat next to me in the public gallery. His hand rested on mine. Kate sat on the other side, her posture rigid with tension. My sister had come too, sitting right behind us, a quiet presence of support. My son sat at the defense table in a suit that seemed too big for him now. He had lost weight during those 3 months on remand, waiting for trial. Bail had been denied, just as our solicitor predicted. The prosecution argued that someone who had stolen over £250,000 and had gambling debts posed a significant flight risk. The judge agreed. The prosecutor was a woman in her 40s, Anna Walker. She was thorough and precise, guiding the jury through every fraudulent transaction using the same spreadsheets I had created 3 years ago. Bank statements were displayed on a large screen for everyone to see, every theft highlighted in red. The names of the fake companies looked even more ridiculous, displayed 20 times larger than in reality. Summit Equipment Consulting, Meridian Business Solutions. Companies that never existed anywhere except in my son's imagination and on forged invoices. When my husband was called to testify, I watched him walk to the stand with slow, measured steps. He looked older than he had 3 months ago. This whole process had aged us both in a way that had nothing to do with time. Prosecutor Walker asked him to describe what the family business meant to him. My husband's voice was steady as he explained that his father had started the company in 1967 with a small bank loan and a lot of determination, that he had worked there since he was 16, that he had always dreamed of passing it on to his son. "And when did you discover that your son was stealing from the company?" asked Prosecutor Walker. "My wife discovered it first," my husband said. "She came to me about 4 months after starting her investigation and showed me what she had found. At first, I didn't want to believe it. I thought there must be some mistake." His voice cracked slightly on the word mistake, and he paused to clear his throat. But the evidence was undeniable. My son was systematically robbing the company my father built. The defense barrister, a sleek man in his 50s with silver hair, tried to suggest that the so-called theft was actually aggressive business decisions that my husband and I, being older and less familiar with modern practices, had misunderstood. My husband immediately shut that down. "I have run this company for 38 years, he said, his voice hard. "I understand the difference between a legitimate business expense and money funneled to fake companies so my son could pay off gambling debts." When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the witness stand feeling strangely calm. I had been preparing for this moment for 3 years. I took the oath on the Bible. And then I sat down and looked straight at the jury. Prosecutor Walker asked me to describe how I first discovered my son was stealing. I told them about the Tuesday afternoon when I brought chicken soup to my husband's office, about the overheard phone call, about the disdain in my son's voice when he said his parents never checked the accounts properly. "What did you do after overhearing that conversation?" she asked. "I went home and started researching forensic accounting," I said. "I learned how to trace financial irregularities. Then I started documenting every fraudulent transaction I could find." "Why didn't you confront your son immediately?" I looked at my son sitting at the defense table. He was staring at his hands, refusing to meet my eyes. "Because I wanted to see how far he would go. I wanted evidence that couldn't be explained away or dismissed, and I wanted to understand who he had really become." The courtroom was completely silent. I felt the jury members leaning forward, fascinated. The defense barrister tried to paint me as vindictive during cross-examination. He suggested that a real mother would have tried to help her son instead of building a case against him. "I did help my son," I said, my voice sounding stronger than I expected. "I helped him face consequences he never would have faced if I had allowed his crimes to continue." I helped my grandchildren avoid growing up with a father who would have taught them that theft and lies are acceptable. And I helped my daughter-in-law leave a toxic marriage before it completely destroyed her. The defense barrister had no answer to that. He sat down, and I saw something on the faces of the jury that told me they understood. They weren't looking at a vindictive mother. They were looking at a woman who had made the hardest decision of her life to protect the people she loved. The verdict came back after only 4 hours of deliberation, guilty on all counts. My son kept his eyes down as the foreman of the jury read each charge. Embezzlement, fraud by abuse of position, mortgage fraud, tax evasion, guilty, 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 guilty. The judge was a woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked at my son over her reading glasses and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the quiet courtroom. Mr. Smith, you stole from your family business. You abused your wife financially and emotionally. You forged documents without remorse. You showed no respect for the people who loved and trusted you. She paused, and in that pause I held my breath. But perhaps your greatest crime was underestimating your mother's intelligence and determination. The sentence is 8 years in custody. The gavel banged with a sharp crack that seemed to echo endlessly. I felt my husband's hand tighten on mine. Kate let out a sob beside me that might have been relief or grief or both. My sister touched my shoulder from behind, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 3 years. Not satisfaction, exactly. Not happiness, but closure. The kind of closure that comes when you finish something difficult, necessary, and irreversible. 6 months after the trial, I stood in my garden on a warm Sunday afternoon in late September, watching my grandchildren play on the lawn. The eldest, Matthew, was 8 now. He was pushing his younger sister, Emily, on the swing my husband had installed last month. Their laughter carried across the grass, pure and carefree, in a way it hadn't been when their father lived with them. Kate sat next to me on the patio, sipping coffee and showing me sketches on her tablet. She was starting a small therapy practice, specializing in recovery from financial abuse. I had helped her with the startup costs money that came from an account my son never knew existed. I got approval for the office space on Deansgate in Manchester, she said, excitement in her voice that I hadn't heard in years. Small, but perfect for starting out. 2 consultation rooms and a waiting area. When do you open? I asked. January, if everything goes to plan. I already have 6 referrals from the Women's Support Center. She looked at her tablet, then back at me. I changed my name legally last week. Back to Davidson. The children are keeping the name Smith for now, but when they're older, they can decide if they want to change it. The divorce had been finalized 3 months ago. Full custody to Kate, with supervised visits only after my son gets out of prison in 4 years. He'd likely serve half of the 8 years. The house had been sold to pay off the fraudulent second mortgage and the gambling debts. Kate and the children now lived in a smaller flat closer to my house, closer to safety, support, and a family that actually wanted to protect them. The family business was prospering in a way it hadn't for years. My husband had promoted 3 long-term employees who had been overlooked while our son occupied the vice president position. The company culture improved almost immediately. People smiled more. Meetings were productive instead of tense, and profits were actually higher without the constant drain of embezzled funds disappearing into casinos. I had taken on a more active role myself. My 3 years of studying forensic accounting translated into a permanent position as Director of Financial Oversight. I reviewed every account, every transaction, every supplier relationship. No one would ever steal from this company again. Not on my watch. "Granny, look," Matthew called from the swing. He was showing Emily how to pump her legs to go higher, patient, so different from the anxious, secretive child he had been a year ago. Kate had enrolled him in therapy immediately after the separation. The therapist said Matthew had been covering for his father's absences and unpredictable behavior for over a year, lying to teachers and friends to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. Slowly, carefully, he was learning that honesty was safer than lies, that telling the truth wouldn't lead to punishment or chaos. Emily, only 5, had suffered in different ways: nightmares, bedwetting, fear of loud noises. But now she slept peacefully in her new bedroom, with a moon-shaped nightlight. Kate said she hadn't had a nightmare in 2 months. I watched them play and felt something settle in my chest. This was why I had spent 3 years documenting instead of confronting. This safety, this peace, this chance for them to have a childhood shaped not by their father's lies and abuse. My sister arrived with a peach crumble, still warm from the oven, and news that made Kate's eyes light up. Thank you for listening to this story with me today. If it moved you or made you think about the strength mothers can find in the hardest moments, please subscribe to hear more touching stories tomorrow. Your support means everything to me, and I can't wait to share the next journey with you.